Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. Following the extraordinarily swift return of the Taliban to power, we'll be asking, what does the future hold for Afghanistan? Success or failure? We'll get the view of the former head of the British Army's Joint Forces Command on the fall of Kabul. Plus, will the Afghan outcome mark a step change in Western military policy? And what next for the women of Afghanistan? We'll hear from Afghan MP and women's rights campaigner Farzana Elham. The current crisis in Afghanistan essentially began on September the 11th, 2001, the date of the largest ever terror attack on US soil, when 4 passenger planes were hijacked by al-Qaeda and flown into buildings, killing over 3,000 people. The attacks had been planned from Taliban-led Afghanistan. By October, the US and UK began to bomb al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan. By December the 17th, the Taliban had been driven from power. But it wasn't until October 2004 that the people of Afghanistan got to vote in their first election since the fall of Taliban. Hamid Karzai became president. Deadly Taliban attacks continued, with British troops arriving in the southern stronghold of Helmand in 2006. In 2009, President Obama sent more troops. Numbers reach 140,000. That helps push back against the Taliban, but only for a short time. In 2014, the bloodiest year since 2001, NATO ends its combat missions in the country.
Afghans will take full responsibility for their security, and our combat mission will be over. America's war in Afghanistan will come to a responsible end.
The Afghan army is now expected to be responsible for its own security, with training given by some remaining US and UK troops. The Taliban saw this as an opportunity and soon started seizing more territory. The conflict drags on, and in 2017, US President Trump hints that US support for Afghans won't last forever.
America will work with the Afghan government as long as we see determination and progress. However, our commitment is not unlimited, and our support is not a blank check.
By 2020, after talks in Doha, a deal is reached to look at withdrawing foreign forces from Afghanistan. But the Taliban continue to attack the remaining US and UK troops and carry out targeted assassinations. Earlier this year, the Taliban launched a spring offensive targeting Western embassies, NATO headquarters, and the Parliament building.
Thank you all so very much.
US President Biden confirms he will withdraw all remaining US troops. All foreign troops under NATO command will leave by September the 11th. Violence escalates, and the Taliban start to take more territory. And then on August the 15th, the Taliban, having captured all the country's major cities, moved into Kabul. So, after 20 years of conflict and almost 200,000 civilian and military lives lost, the Taliban is once again in control of Afghanistan. With me now to consider just what that means is General Sir Richard Barrons, former commander of the British Army's Joint Forces Command, who served in Afghanistan from October 2009. General, looking at the facts, it all seems as though it's a complete failure by the West. But US Secretary of State Antony Blinken insists the US mission in Afghanistan was, in his word, a success. What's your view?
So I think there are grounds for saying it's been successful, but they're rather limited. So if we recognize that the reason for going to Afghanistan in the first place was to remove the sources of terrorism that had inflicted 9/11 on the US, well, that was successfully accomplished. And as things stand today, Afghanistan is not being used as a haven for terrorism, but the future looks much more uncertain than it did when the US-led Western forces were in the country. And I think the second thing that America is making very clear is it can't see any profound strategic national interest to remain propping up Afghanistan. and they've other things to focus on. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that they'll find that the outcome in Afghanistan is not in America's strategic interests.
When you deployed to Afghanistan in 2009, it was part of an effort to persuade the Taliban to, shall we say, rejoin society. That didn't work, did it?
No, it didn't work, although I think we were the start of a process that has run right through to this year. But I think underlying that was the really key thought that this struggle in Afghanistan could have been brought to a close by a discussion between the Afghan Taliban, who after all are Afghans, and the other interests in Afghanistan, and that would have resulted in a sharing of power, but in a much more manageable way than we're seeing now, and with the preservation of many of the advantages that have been gained over the last 20 years. This was never a war until the last 2 weeks that was going to result in military victory, and it needn't have been so.
Why do you think the Allies were so keen to leave Afghanistan? Let me rephrase that. Why do you think the US was so keen to pull out of Afghanistan? Was it for domestic political reasons, do you think, or was there some wider plan?
No, I think this was driven by domestic political reasons, infected by the very difficult outcome in Iraq, and the sense that the deployment in Afghanistan wasn't going anywhere. Set against that, we have to recognize is that the size of the American deployment and the activities that they were conducting were absolutely manageable by the US and by the West. I think the US taxpayer was still making a mighty contribution to Afghanistan, but the military effort was frankly pretty modest. So I think this was for domestic political reasons to end the forever wars. I don't think it was really about the cost of the commitment.
Were you surprised at the speed of the takeover?
I think the truth of it is that the Afghan national security forces had the numbers and the capability and the training to hold the line. But they then saw a number of things happening that completely undermined that. So they immediately asked themselves, well, why would I fight for this district or province when the local people have now swung over to the Taliban? And then they looked over their shoulders and they saw that the American effort that supplied intelligence, air power, logistics, and planning guidance had disappeared. And then they saw their own political and military leaders of very mixed quality evaporating. And in those circumstances, they fell away. And it feels very like what we saw in Mosul in Iraq some years ago.
So it was basically the local population in the regions, the districts, thinking, OK, well, the Americans aren't going to be here for a while. We might as well welcome the Taliban. And is that sort of a begrudging welcome, or is there any kind of genuine welcome of the Taliban taking over?
That's a very good question. And I think the answer is very complex. There are undoubtedly places in Afghanistan, particularly in the more rural areas, where the population sees the Taliban as a better thing than the government that came from Kabul. The Taliban taxed them less, provided order and security in a way that many Afghans recognized, and allowed them to continue to grow as much poppy as they could. And you know, poppy is, after war, the major export of Afghanistan. So there are some Afghans who see this as not a bad thing. There'll be a modus vivendi and it'll be okay. There'll be other Afghans that are ambivalent about it. They'll put their head down and they'll hope just to carry on. And loyalty in Afghanistan for centuries has essentially been a bought commodity. And then, my goodness, there are many, many Afghans, particularly those in the cities, for whom this is a catastrophe. This is casting them back literally to the Dark Ages.
The big fear now in the West, in European capitals and in Washington, is that it will become a base for jihadists. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are quoted, their spokesman, as saying they welcome the return of the Taliban. Would it be a center for terrorism again, do you suspect?
So I think the Taliban know to say loudly, clearly, and often that they'll not allow this to happen in Afghanistan. I think the truth is that it may well be beyond the capacity of the Taliban to prevent it everywhere in Afghanistan, and I'm pretty sure there are some elements in the Taliban, which is not a monolithic organization, that will think that, you know, this will be quite a cool thing, that Al-Qaeda can come back and they can shake their fist at the West. But the surest way for a Taliban-led Afghanistan to attract the sort of attention it doesn't want from the international community, which will include from the US and China and many other places, is to allow this to happen. And then I think there's a second dimension, is that this victory for a very conservative Islamic mission in Afghanistan will embolden violent religious extremism, terrorism that's elsewhere in the world. They'll think their time is coming again. So this problem won't just be in Afghanistan.
And lastly, General, do you think this will have any lasting effect on Western military policy?
You know, I truly, truly hope so, because I think this is such a shock. This is such a blow to Western standing, reputation, and strategic interest that it's going to cause some introspection. And I think the absolutely vital point for the West and many other nations that will come out of this is that this has turned out badly. We essentially gave up and left, and the outcome is not the one at all that we would have chosen. But we're now looking at a world which will be challenged by the rise of Asia and China in this century, by the profound instability that climate change is going to cause to societies, economies, and relationships between states, and the shock of the digital age in the way that it fractures industries and societies and cultures in ways that are going to be, I think, genuinely historic. And I think the question for the West is, this didn't go well. We didn't stand up for our interests. But then we'll recognize that our interests, our true strategic interests in Afghanistan, were pretty modest. But just coming down the road, there are things that are going to happen in our world where every nation is going to have to stand up with its friends to protect its security and its prosperity and its values and its interests. And the West is going to have to rediscover the will and the capability to go abroad and do that with its partners, or it'll just get pushed around. And I think that is the key strategic question that's come out of this debacle.
General Sir Richard Barrons, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you very much.
As the Taliban takes back control of Afghanistan, many are particularly concerned for the nation's women. The country's new leaders have claimed they'll honour women's rights, quote, within the norms of Islamic law, unquote. But what might that actually mean? Joining me now from Kabul is Afghan MP Farzana Elham. Farzana, did you expect this to happen so quickly after President Biden first announced the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan?
No, I wasn't actually. I had some interviews in back days. I was, when they were asking, I was saying, and I was believing that if the Taliban, even if they win the war, they can take control of this Kabul even in years. I was expecting them to be here in 2 years, in 1 year, at least in some months. But it happened so fast, and it was not expected at all. It shocked everyone in here. We just slept at night. Then at the morning, we saw the Taliban are here. So we were stuck here, and then it was not expected at all. It happened so fast.
You've dedicated much of your career to talking about and working for female inclusion. Are you concerned for the future for women in new Afghanistan?
Yes, of course I am, and everyone is, because we have an experience of Taliban being in control of the Afghanistan. We have that experience from the time, and as well as their thoughts and beliefs, the nature of the Taliban, the way they treat the women. Just last day, in these days, when they are having some interview and they are sharing that from their addresses, they are covering up the women at all. So for the time being, as that's not clear that if they just made some commitment to the women's rights or not. So I am concerned, and I'm so much concerned about what will happen to the women of Afghanistan, whether they will have a right to have access to education, whether they will have a right to participate in the society, whether they will have a right to do what they want, like their jobs in order to jobs and these things. So, or whether they would be locked on their houses.
So you think the future looks bleak?
I think for us the priority is not to talk about the way that we dress up or the way we appear in the society. So the thing is that would they allow us to have this access to education, jobs, and these things or not to our right, like men do? Do we have that right? The first important thing, the priority is the safety of the women who are civil activists, who are women rights activists, human rights activists, who are not covering up the way the Taliban demand, not saying the Taliban demand, like those who are against the Taliban and talking against them and against, not like it's not their enemy, but the way the Taliban treated Afghan people and women, the women got a right to talk about that, and they did that. So the thing is now, even they would be judged by the things that the women said and did in the past or not. The safety and security of the women is so much important at the first priority. After that, having access to education, health, and everything that men do, this is so important for us. And of course, if the Taliban don't do that, so the legitimacy and the Taliban government can't rule exactly the way they should.
Do you feel safe in the current climate, especially as you are seen as a campaigner for female rights?
Unfortunately, I'm not. Every minute I can expect something happen that I never expected that. And I have been through this unexpected thing happening so fast in here in Afghanistan, in Kabul, right, and now these days. So I just am making myself to be strong and ready for the things that I'm not expecting and would happen. So I'm like I have a fear and I'm scared of that. Like, to be as a human being, I'm like other humans. So this is all the thing that Taliban at this point can do. Before they were doing everything, but at this point they are pretending that they need the international community's trust. So for that, I think if they are looking for the trust and the aids and good diplomatic relation with the international community, they need to have their trust by something that they should offer differently from the last time that they did.
How do you think the international community should react to the takeover? What is their role? And should they get involved in Afghanistan?
They have been involved already. They have been involved in the peace talks and everything, and then they made a deal with the Taliban, and they just took steps.
They probably made that deal in Doha before, because that's why it all happened so quickly. But do you see that deal as the West washing its hands?
Yes, it's somehow like that. But I'm not here to blame them. Everyone have a choice and have a priority. Maybe Afghan lives and Afghan people who are not a priority for them and is not for now too. So we can't expect them to be a priority or a second priority for them. So I'm not blaming them, as I'm disappointed from these talks and these things. But at least they can do something that to make sure that here the Afghanistan is not changing to a threat to the world again, by allowing women, by allowing young generation the rights that they deserve, and those things that make a community, a country, a society a best one, and that everyone can speak up. So this way they won't allow the Taliban to rule as they want, as they demand. So this how we can have some changes and something that we are looking for and make a society better one. So this is for the sake of the world too, not for the Afghan people or women. So the thing that international community do is to set some requirement for the Taliban to fulfill these things, then we will have the relations and those things that you demand.
Farzana Elham, MP in Kabul, many thanks for joining us on The Agenda.
Welcome.
Still to come here on The Agenda, echoes of Saigon. Will Afghanistan turn out to be America's next Vietnam? Murray, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The Agenda. The message from Washington since Kabul fell to the Taliban is, this isn't Saigon. The US government certainly wants to avoid any parallels between the situation in Afghanistan and the end of the war in Vietnam in the 1970s. But just how similar are the two events? I'm joined now by the only American television correspondent to cover the fall of Saigon and stay in the city afterwards, and who also flew out to the US from Phnom Penh when it fell to the Khmer Rouge. Award-winning journalist and author of The Last Helicopter, Two Lives in Indochina, Jim Laurie. Jim, watching the helicopters take off, one of them carrying President Ghani from Kabul, must have prompted memories from Saigon for you.
Absolutely, Stephen. I think there probably are three categories of people who are watching this from afar who are most impacted. First, of course, the Afghans themselves and the families and friends they have all around the world. And then, of course, those UK soldiers and American troops who served in Afghanistan. And perhaps third are people like myself who saw all this happen in very much the same way back 46 years ago, first in Phnom Penh and then in Saigon. The similarities are striking. Of course, the differences are huge. Now, the biggest issue for me, frankly, was the humanitarian issue. In Vietnam, we had a little bit longer at the very end. The South Vietnamese troops fought, the Taliban did not. The South Vietnamese held off the North Vietnamese for 55 days. And so we had more time to get people out. And the evacuation of Saigon began roughly 1 month before the fall. But still, there was a concerted effort to take in Vietnamese back in 1975. I don't see the same effort being made in 2021 with the Afghans.
What does it say? Because all the journalism, certainly in London and in European papers that I'm seeing today, is about a perceived failure of American military power. Now, is that important, do you think, in terms of how people regard America as a superpower?
I think that once again, as it did in 1975, the question of the reliability of America comes up. Is the United States, are their promises willing to be kept? Will they be kept? Can they be believed? And I think once again, this reinforces the notion that America is not necessarily a reliable partner. And I think that's going to be the impact of this. As
is that
it was
dangerous,
for a while,
Jim?
the impact. Well, it is dangerous if you assume that the United States has some role in the world to support nations and peoples who need help. And this is where it gets very tricky, because I mean, Biden is right in one regard. The mission in Afghanistan, the original mission, was not to rebuild a country. The original mission was to rid Afghanistan of those radical elements, al-Qaeda elements, that were threatening directly United States issues. And of course, every nation in the world shapes their policies based upon selfish national interests. It was the whole nation-building aspect that got out of control, it seems to me, and that is the problem, the crux of the problem that we have today. lifting up the hopes. And I remember standing in front of the American embassy in Saigon after the fall and having a young woman come up to me with her American identification card and saying, "They left me behind. They betrayed me. Why did they do this?" You see the same scenario playing out today.
Lastly, Jim, I ask you to look in your crystal ball. You covered Asia for many years. What do you think the impact of the return of the Taliban will have on the region, especially geopolitically, sandwiched between Pakistan and India?
I think this all depends on whether you can believe what the Taliban spokesperson said at a news conference earlier this week. If you believe what he said, and if they do follow through, and they did make a pledge at that news conference that Afghanistan would not harbor extremist groups from the outside, and will they keep their promises? This is the big question. Is it really the old Taliban of 20 years ago? I was in Afghanistan back in the old days. I accompanied Russian troops when they left, and I must say the Russian withdrawal in 1989 was far smoother than the American withdrawal. The Russians went up through Mazar-e-Sharif to Kunduz and out to Uzbekistan in convoys, and it was a reasonably orderly withdrawal. Now, the Taliban came to power roughly 5 years after the Russians left. And the question is it the old Taliban that is now back in power, or is it Taliban 2.0? I don't think we know that right now. And it all depends on whether you believe what they say. And we're going to have to wait and see on that.
Jim Laurie, many thanks for joining us here on The Agenda.
Thank you, Stephen.
In 1839, the British Army marched into Afghanistan to impose civilization on the fractious Afghans, install a puppet ruler, and give Britain the upper hand in the so-called Great Game. That was the struggle for dominance in Central and Southern Asia. The British force comprised 58,000 people and a pack of foxhounds and camels to carry the wine, the port, and the cigars. It all ended badly for Great Britain, but just to prove that lessons from history are rarely learned, the Russians did the same over a century later, but with far more firepower, until they too pulled out, defeated by the Mujahideen. Now the US military has gone, despite a 20-year presence in Afghanistan, supported by a massive intelligence and logistical effort. What had been intended as a measured withdrawal became a humiliating Saigon-style flight. The fall of Kabul is seen as a disaster for women's rights, the rule of law, Western foreign policy, and probably global security. The Taliban promised, though, the issue of women was important and that they didn't want any internal or external enemies. But a female Afghan MP, Farzana Elham, told me, "I'm afraid for myself, my life, my freedom to work and to speak up." And fear of the future under Taliban rule is why there's been such a rush for the exits by so many. 20 years after US and British forces overthrew the last Taliban regime, and 9 months after Joe Biden was elected, with a promise to end the forever wars, Taliban fighters entered the Afghan capital with barely a shot being fired. The Taliban are now in full control of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. Don't forget, you can watch everything from past Agenda episodes and find additional exclusive content on our website, cgtn.com/Europe, or on our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @CGTN Europe. Coming up on a future Agenda, solving the poverty crisis. We'll have an exclusive interview with the Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Programme, Amir Mahmoud Abdullah. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.